You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 365 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going well, Jeremy. A little brisk now as we've moved into the fall weather here in Chicago.
It was a day. I was definitely felt the chill in the air. Hockey season has begun, and we are watching baseball playoffs in October. We are not watching the Cubs. We'll get into that, and we'll unpack all of...
It's not because we're boycotting the Cubs either.
No.
It's for
other
reasons outside of our control.
Oh, the reasons. We'll get into them as we unpack the end of the season. This is where we get our closure on another season that was for the Chicago Cubs. And to help us talk about all things this season, look ahead to next season, you know him from his wonderful contributions on this podcast and, of course, all of his fine writings all over the internet. I'll let him tell you where he's at nowadays. It's Matt Trueblood. Matt, thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs with us today.
Always, but now I'm very worried about this podcast because closure was a major problem for the Cubs this year. And if that's what we're aiming for, I'm worried we're going to blow it.
Can't do any worse.
Yeah. No, we'll show them how it's done. Matt, please remind our listeners where they can read your work on the internet.
Northsidebaseball.com is the best one for this particular audience. Also on Baseball Prospectus a couple of times a week. And if you take any interest in these teams as in one way or another, I think you probably will at points this winter. I am also the managing editor and a writer at both Twins Daily and BrewerFanatic.com.
Now, let's talk about those Cubs. So, since we last podcasted, Pat, we got a letter, as we do every year.
You guys are special.
We get a letter from Tom Ricketts, owner of the Chicago Cubs, where he every year tells us how disappointing the season was, how we need to get better, and you'll never believe how great our farm system is. Pat, I'll start with you. Your initial thoughts on getting what feels like a familiar letter from Tom Ricketts.
Yeah, it was a little ho-hum. He at least acknowledged that the season... He didn't use words like disaster, but he acknowledged that it fell short of expectations, which clearly it did. He did cite inconsistent play, which I think is a fair characterization of much of the season. He also cited injuries, which bothered me a little bit just because I don't think that is not the reason why the Cubs were not competitive this year. That is the reason why the Atlanta Braves are not going to be in the World Series this year, but it's not the reason the Cubs weren't. Instead, it sort of underscores, I think, this general tension that we've had with the current ownership and operations running of the team, which is that they try to skate through on a very narrow, thin line. And one way to protect yourself against injuries or perhaps inconsistent / poor play from individuals is to have better individuals and more of them and have depth. And if you can do that, then you can protect yourself, or you can aggressively go get new players who can come in, like example, the Braves did again this year, at the trade deadline, but the Cubs don't really do that very much. And in fact, I think we knew coming into the season, I'm sure, Matt, your prospectus people and all the other, the Dan Zaborskis and the rest of the people in the world were telling us this was an 83-win team, and we didn't believe them. But here we are. The computers apparently did not lie. It is what it is, and that's because they didn't have the volume and depth of talent that they needed in order to be better. Full stop. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, Matt, the actual quote here was that early victories delivered hope for postseason baseball. I will also note hope, not a strategy. He goes on to say inconsistent play and injuries upended that promise, leading us into a hole too deep to recover from despite another second half surge.
Sorry, I got to jump in here.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we could not dig out of the hole, because our second half surge included 2 months when we played 500 baseball, that being July and September. Shockingly, when you play 500 baseball and you were under 500 going into that time period, one solid month of August ain't going to cut it. So I don't understand. I don't know what he's talking about when he says the second half surge. There was no second half surge. There were 2 good months. They were April and August. There were 2 mediocre months, July and September, and there were 2 bad months, May and June. That's what happened this season. And I've heard Jed say this. I think Carter said this. Everybody's on this narrative that somehow the Cubs had this rocket ship, second half, and if they just ran out of time or something, they'd be in the playoffs. Well, that's not evident from what I watched in the month of September. Certainly not against the Colorado Rockies in the 9th inning of back-to-back games, or the Dodgers in the game before that, and in a lot of the other games they played that month. So, sorry, Matt, I didn't mean to step on your cue here, but it has been irking me for a while.
No, you're not wrong. I mean, I think you can build an arbitrary endpoints argument that they did surge in the second half. And certainly, as Ricketts sort of alluded to with that they're making a habit of this, falling too far behind and then scrambling to catch up. People forget, I think, that they also finished pretty strong in 2022. That season was way lost by then, of course, much more so than these last 2. But what it really amounts to is over the final 2 months of each of the last 3 seasons, they've eaten their own draft position for lunch and still not even made it to the playoffs. Just end up picking in the middle of the first round every year, which we established a long time ago is no recipe for success. He did identify what the season looked like. I mean, if you're grading him on the accuracy of that description, it's fine. We might have been more interested in the whys and the what are you going to do next, but that this letter is never going to include that information. So it's really just a kind of a nothing burger, and that's what you come to expect from owner letters pretty much any time. They're going to be long-winded ways of not saying anything and then patting themselves on the back that they've been in communication with the fans. So that's the main purpose of these. It's public relations. It's not really meant to do anything or convey anything other than checking a box that, yes, we have communicated to the fan base that we want to be better next year. They could put out a one-sentence statement that way. It could be the same.
Let me ask you, which of these is more plausible? That there are 7 existing handwritten drafts of this that Tom had scribbled together late at night when he was working on the letter, or that the letter was written by AI? Which do you think is a more likely conclusion?
It's more likely the latter, because it had a lot of similarities to the previous incarnation of this letter. I pulled up the 2023 letter to see what it said. Quote, "This wasn't the way we wanted the season to end, and every year we miss the playoffs is a difficult one. However, this season, where we dug ourselves an early hole and then played as well as anyone in the league, only to fall just short of our goal, was particularly disappointing."
Only to play worse than anyone in the league the last 3 weeks of the season. My goodness.
Yeah, so a lot of similarities between 23 and 24, as he continued to say in the 24 letter that we fell short this season and we have strong foundations to build on. The foundations to build on part, he goes on to talk about how
Drew Smiley.
You'll like this. Jed, Carter, and our team of coaches, analysts, scouts, and strategists have created one of the top player development groups in the game today, with 8 prospects on MLB Pipeline's top 100 list, the most of any team in Major League Baseball. After this summer's draft, the Cubs boast a top-flight player development system in most independent rankings, including number 2 in the USA Today's latest evolution. So this evaluation by the USA Today, Matt Trueblood, they're number 2.
Yeah, so they are. And here
Hard
you
to say
keep telling us
whether-
about their poor player development, Matt. What's is it you or USA Today? Who do we believe here?
You know what? I'm not even going to answer that directly. I will leave it up to the listeners to decide whether I or Bob Nightingale are a more astute analyst of baseball in 2024. What I will say is it is a wonderful boon to these owner letters that now we re-rank prospects like every 15 minutes nationwide. It used to be you got a list in the spring and you had to live with that until maybe you got a shorter one at the All-Star break and then again until the spring. Not anymore. We got re-ranks once a month almost. And that's at the league's official site, so you know it's good. It's a 24/7, 365 prospect ranking apparatus across multiple outlets. You can always find ways to brag about your farm system. And I'm not saying the Cubs farm system isn't fine right now. But I do think we also, if we're going to re-rank this often and we're going to give the Cubs credit for having, let's say it's accurate that it's 8 of the top 100 players in the minor leagues at this moment at the end of the season. We didn't used to know who had 8 people, the eight of the 100 best people in the minor leagues come September every year. Because if a prospect was really good, if they had started the year, they'd graduate into the majors, you knew they were going to be off that list. And now it was about, well, how many will they have on next year's list? And we've never even matured to the point where instead of that, we rank overall young, controllable, high-end talent, by which reckoning, there's no way you could put the Cubs second in the league. They're not top 5. They might not be top 10. The depth is impressive. It's fine. I would also say because some of those guys failed to matriculate to the majors this year, whether because they didn't really get that opportunity or injury compromised them or whatever, it's not like there's a young player on the Cubs, on the actual big league team, who is, say, and I know it's impossible for a team in the Central to acquire someone and develop them into a star, the likes of Jackson Churio, to pick one possible person, but you couldn't do that. Obviously, the Cubs don't have the resources to develop a star like Jackson Churio from within, so they do have to settle a bit. But what they're settling for right now is a pretty, not really a very young roster, a pretty old roster full of guys who are average to slightly above, and that's the good half of the roster. And then a minor league system that's crowded with good options, but guys who, if we're being honest with ourselves, in a year when the prospect list was pretty rich and you were only ranking once or twice a year instead of 5 or 6 times, no way this is 8 of a top 100. No way, Matt Shaw is one of the top 20 prospects in the game. It's not that caliber of system. It's just there are facts scattered throughout the internet that they can collect and paint a picture with, but they're misleading. That's not what this team is.
Any future corner outfield platoon hitters, perhaps? The minors?
I see an entire corner outfield platoon just sitting at Iowa, ready to step in next year. Whether it'll be a good one, I guess we'll see. But yeah.
A fun note, the 2022 letter from Tom Ricketts said that Fangraphs ranked their farm system 5th in baseball.
Mm-hmm.
2023 letter said that their farm system is ranked among the top 5 in MLB, and they have 6 players in the top 100 prospect list. One of those players last year was PCA as well. So this year they've got 8, and that was noting after the draft, as including the people that and so it's funny that they keep trotting out this same stat of being in the top 10, but we're seeing the same record in production and development. So you talk about your player development system here. You can have the players ranked high, but if you can't develop them, then what's the point? Move them out.
Is Matt Mervis still on the list, Jeremy?
If
he has a nickname and everything.
Well, he's got a couple of nicknames, really, if you want him bad enough. If it were not misleading, if last year they had touted the farm system exactly the way they did, and it was reflective of something real, And then over this previous winter, you went out and added Shota Imanaga on a perfectly reasonable contract and traded for Michael Busch, who turned out the way he did. You know what would have happened? The Cubs would have made the playoffs. I mean, it's a perfect illustration of the fact that these farm system rankings, they're not completely detached from reality. The Cubs do have talent there. One, the Cubs have been very bad for several years now at converting that talent into actual star caliber big leaguers. And two,
big leaguers, period, for the most part. I mean, beside Nico Horner, and maybe PCA now.
Part of the reason the system gets ranked so high every year is because they've gotten to just rank Owen Casey and Kevin Alcantara and Cade Horton over and over and over. Again. And they'll get to rank them all again next year because they're still eligible. It's a problem, man.
Just as not to depress anybody, but off the top of your heads, who do you think led the Cubs in WAR this year? Just take a wild guess.
Imanaga, right?
I would bet it's either Dansby or Nico, because WAR is giving way too much credit to their position and overestimating their defense besides.
Soon to be 31-year-old Dansby Swanson led the Cubs with 4 WAR, right ahead of Ian Happ, who's at 3.9.
Yeah.
I know. I'm beginning, as I've grown older, I'm beginning to question WAR a little bit more than I used to, because I see it doesn't always seem to be passing the eye test like I assumed it would be. And I understand the complexity of, I don't understand the complexity of it. How about that? Especially when it comes to sort of the invisible defensive aspect of that. I feel like it's a lot easier to calibrate offense than it is defense. And I'm not certain that Dansby Swanson was the best player on the Cubs last year, for example. I just did not. That was not what I saw when I watched the Cubs.
Well, and I completely agree with you. I am out on WAR. I haven't used it. In fact, I wrote an article a month or so ago declaring you're never going to see me cite WAR in an article again. Not because the concept is totally laughable or anything, but because there are several things. But I'll just touch on one right now, which is the positional adjustment is all out of whack. That basically accounts for the expected difference between what a first baseman can produce offensively and what a shortstop can. Except this year, throughout the league, shortstops outhit first baseman. So we're giving Dansby Swanson credit for being almost comparable to Michael Busch at the plate, when Dansby Swanson's peers hit better than Michael Busch's peers. So what are we doing? It's a framework that was better suited to a slightly different version of the game 20 years ago when it was first created. But we don't have to go all the way down that rabbit hole. You're definitely
What do you think about offensive WAR? For example, on Baseball Reference, they break out offensive WAR versus defensive WAR. Do you think that gives you at least some understanding of where the WAR is coming from for players?
Yeah, although, and I'll just go to another part of it, is, to me, I'm kind of done anchoring to the idea of a replacement level, because that replacement level has changed so much. It's a very owner-friendly framework, first of all, replacement level. And secondly, it worked especially well when it was designed, which was just a few years after the most recent expansion. We are now a quarter century past the last expansion. And until another one comes, it's probably another decade away. I don't think anchoring to replacement is what we really want to do. I think you want to know, is this player better or worse than average at everything? We have that data, but people slide right past it to talk about WAR instead. I'd rather talk about runs above and below average, fielding, batting, base running. And then there are interaction factors we can examine between teammates too. Runs rather than wins, average rather than replacement is where I'd like to anchor those conversations. And when you start to do that, you can see some of the cracks in what the Cubs have built.
Let's close out on this letter, and then we'll move to talk about some of the moves that they did this year. The moves that they talked about to fix this problem in 2022, they said we'll be active in free agency and have the necessary resources available to substantially supplement our current roster. 2023, We will continue to be active this offseason to supplement our roster and look for contributions from our pipeline of elite homegrown talent. This year's letter, nothing about being active to supplement the roster. Maybe
they're getting Juan Soto? Or no?
Maybe it could be because they're going to be a little itchy because they went over the luxury tax this year in a surprise to everybody. In August, Jed Hoyer was on the Score and said, quote, "But as far as this year, we sort of looked at it in the end of February." Let's note that. At the end of February, and we were likely to be under the tax. But once we decided to sign Bellinger, we sort of brought what I thought was a fantastic deal for the Cubs to bring back Cody, knowing that when we did it, it was very likely to trigger us being over the tax. Tom Ricketts and Crane Kenny were in favor of that, knowing what it meant for the club.
I believe that statement is not truthful.
Which part?
And here's the part about how Bellinger signing would put them over the luxury tax. At the time they signed Bellinger, most of us in the regular world thought they were still under the luxury cap, and no one did anything to dispel that notion at the time within the organization or anywhere else. I heard or read the other day the Cubs ended up going over the luxury tax by like $300,000.
$280,000.
$280,000.
Yes.
So it was the Isaac Paredes move that put the Cubs over the luxury cap, not the Bellinger move.
You are absolutely correct that looking at over at the COTS baseball contracts is what I was using for the source for that material. Yes, at the start of the season, the beginning, day one of the baseball season, the Cubs were under the luxury tax. It was but at the end of the season, they are over the luxury tax by $280,000, which means that the moves that they did, acquiring Paredes, not getting rid of enough people, definitely was what put them over, not signing Bellinger. Bellinger's money is exactly the same as it was on the opening day roster as it was at the end of the season. And so the variables in that equation,
they weren't paying any
Bellinger.
bonuses to Neris or any, it wasn't like they got caught up on one of those things. Is it possible that they just screwed up?
Yeah. Well, I would say where Jed would find shelter in saying that statement was on the level is that what he said was, once we signed Bellinger, we projected that we were going to go over the tax. Not that they were in that moment, but what he was allowing for were some of those bonuses and incentives. And I don't know what it all tabulated up to be, but I know Drew Smiley hit some of his.
But the one we knew he would hit, I think,
I mean, it was likely, but once he did, that was going to make it tough too. And he anticipated that there would be moves within the season. I think one thing is to the extent that it was a calculated choice like this. And I think he knew at least that signing Bellinger to that structure of a deal dramatically increased the likelihood they'd go over the tax. The error there was he thought he was bringing his team from 84 wins to 88. And what he was really doing was bringing them from 80 to 82. He was wrong about how much Bellinger was worth, and he was wrong about where the team was sitting without him. And I think we can give him some leeway on the first one because Bellinger, we all had a pretty good understanding that there were wide error bars around what he was going to deliver this year, because last year's numbers were so impressive but so strange. But we could all tell
were in a box too, right? Like the Cubs couldn't afford to lose more offense. They needed to improve their offense, so they had to do it somehow.
Right. But I think they just believed in Bellinger basically repeating what he did last year. which sounds a little bit crazy to certain ears, given the expected stats and all of that. It wasn't entirely crazy to me, but I do think he was wrong. He was shifting what the team was without Bellinger. He was just wrong about what that was in a way that we could all see at the time. And I don't know why he couldn't. There was some real overestimation of what they had in-house baked into that projection. And so, yeah, they end up in this situation where, and I think the big screw up, you asked if they screwed up, I say yes. But I think the big screw up is they went to Milwaukee the end of June, the last series in June, lost 2 out of 3 and were lucky not to be swept. They were way out of the division race. I started saying right then, this team needs to be sellers. The trade for Paredes, I'm fine with. I think it's a really interesting, attempt to salvage something from Morel. They got a player that I like and still think can help them in future seasons. But they needed to be aggressive sellers around that. And that included offloading salary. And they just skipped that step. And so now they end up over the tax threshold by a paltry, unhelpful amount, simply because they didn't find any, even if it meant attaching a crummy prospect. You've got this incredibly deep farm system, more talent than you know what to do with, right? Tom Ricketts wrote it in the letter. Why didn't you use any of it, if that's what it came to get Drew Smiley the heck off your books for the final 2 months?
Or even Patrick Wisdom. Wouldn't it have taken much at that point?
Hardly anything. I mean, really hardly anything, to the point that it didn't even need to be Smiley. You could have traded just picks. You probably could have traded just Mike Talkman and DFA'd Patrick Wisdom and see if someone picks him up and pays the prorated minimum. That would have gotten you onto the line.
Yeah.
What this is all born of is a double delusion. The first one being that they were a playoff team on the brink of something even better if they just signed Bellinger. Whoops, that's not what was happening. And the second being they got to July and they still thought they were contenders. They weren't.
Let's just say that at the trading deadline, just to remind everybody, at the end of July, the Cubs had yet to have their best month, which was August, which was not enough to propel them into the playoffs. But just to show you how low they were in July and how far they still had to go, they ended up having their best month after that, and it still didn't matter. So that's, there was a lot of catching up to do, and they were not able to do it. The greatest fear I have is that by going over the luxury tax by this piddling amount, I don't care about the penalty. It's virtually nothing in terms of cash for this year. My concern is that this is going to mean that the organization decides, well, we went over it last year. We don't want to go over it this year, because then if we go over it next year, we trigger even bigger problems. So since we're dropping a lot of payroll and on dead bad contracts that we signed at
Trey Mancini, looking at you,
Mancini and Barnhart and others, and just the Hendricks deal and other things, another offseason move they made, picking up the option on him, all that stuff. That they're going to say, we can still get some quality free agents with the $50 million or so we'll have to play with. And then we'll just rely on the farm system again, and we'll stay under the luxury cap, and that way, luxury tax, and then that way we'll have the flexibility to go over it in the future if we want to, which is a very mid-market, small market way of kind of contemplating this, I think.
And just to remind people, no one should worry about the tax that the Ricketts have to pay. That's nothing. It's a tiny, tiny amount in the scheme of a baseball budget. And also, Tom Ricketts,
it's a couple innings of beers. It really is. It's not that much.
So the if a team goes over the luxury tax for one season, it's a 20% tax. So 20% of your $280,000 that you went over the
56 grand.
56 grand. Not a big deal for this year. It's
shoes for the players. It's nothing.
Yes. When you go over for the second consecutive season, that tax goes up to 30%. And then the one that would make Ricketts concerned is the third season in a row, which would now be, because we lost a season, right? We wasted being over the cap, being over the tax without going really over the tax. And so now you're just looking 2 years from now. That third season over the tax would raise it up 50%. And that's where, if you were signing a big ticket free agent and you were going well over the tax there, 50%, that's numbers that makes Ricketts concerned.
You start to count their salary as half again what it is, because marginally that's what it looks like. And that's so monetarily, going over multiple times becomes an issue. Although, again, I would argue still not an issue that we should care about at all. In fact,
correct.
The fundamental problem in terms of the ownership and budget is that the Rickettses are unwilling and possibly even unable. I'm not willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on this, but let's just say it's possible that they are fundamentally unable to spend like the Dodgers, the Yankees, and the Mets, who are not outspending them by $10 million. They're outspending them by $100 million. The Cubs should be spending so much more than this that the tax should not even be, it should be way out on the periphery of our consideration. But I want to touch on one more thing, which is by going over this tax, there is a material penalty that matters more than the tax, which is now if you sign a free agent who's attached to the qualifying offer, it increases by between $1 and $1.5 million, which sounds like nothing, but stick with me here. Your spending power in the draft and international free agency next year. So that pipeline that they're so proud of, and that is really important, I don't mean to diminish it, and that is hard capped by the league. So you really have no ways to kind of work around that. You lose that much spending power, which translates to an awful lot of young talent that you can't bring into the organization by signing a qualifying offer free agent, which again, you can live with, except you only went over by 280,000. What were you doing?
When you go over, go hard. That's the rule, right? Like when you go over, go all the way over. Don't mess around with the piddly $280,000 over. That feels like financial malfeasance somehow.
I want to say too, we're all at this point, Jed said it, and the numbers that are in public now suggest it. But I do want to leave open the door because the accounting stays fuzzy all the way up until they announce it. There could be fluctuations. They could actually be just under the tax. And then, no harm, no foul. But the apparent way that they managed this and what seems to have prompted each of their decision sets right before the season, during the season, it seems awfully misguided.
So we started talking about how this could impact the status of the upcoming off seasons. Everything, it seems, hinges on what is Cody Bellinger going to do. We all think he's opting in because, of course, he would, right? But we thought the same thing with Marcus Stroman, and he opted out. So, based on who's out there, Matt, does it seem like the kind of market that Scott Boras and Cody Bellinger would like to try, or is it one more year? Let's cash in and then hit the market. What's your prediction on that?
For me, if I'm making the decision rationally for Cody, I'm staying right there. That contract is comfy. There's a lot of danger out there with the TV money ramifications all over the league, and maybe even affecting the Cubs, although in a different way than it's affecting the teams who are related to Bally Sports and Diamond Sports Group. But I think some of that would be pushing me toward conservatism in general as a pending free agent, given the year that Bellinger had and the fact that I think a lot of the league no longer sees him as a center fielder. I would be staying in the deal. But the smoke signals all seem to suggest they're interested in going back out there. And there is just enough sort of thinness or weird shapedness to the free agent market that you could justify it. And of course, Bellinger can't be offered another qualifying offer, so he'd be out there untethered to that, unlike some of the other top free agents.
I don't see how he could make the money the Cubs owe him in the next 2 years in anything less than 3 years.
Yeah, I think the argument would be the idea with this type of
4-year, 5-year deal. Is that the idea?
Exactly.
Less money per year, but more money overall.
We just saw Matt Chapman sign a deal much like Bellinger's that had opt-outs. And then before he even needed to trigger the opt-out, the Giants gave him a 6-year deal. That's not going to happen for Bellinger, but he could go out into the market here and find a 5-year deal. And even if the AAV is $5 million lower, he's doing probably better, because I think too, another 2 years down the road with this profile and his piling up injury history, and he'd be on the wrong side of 30 then. I wouldn't necessarily want to be a free agent trying to make a lot of money then. It's a risk, but I think Boris is, comfortable enough with that risk that he might just toss him out there and see what he can do.
If Bellinger does opt out, it sounds to me from what you're saying, he's going to be exhausted next year playing center field in Colorado for his new team, the Colorado Rockies, on that beautiful 5-year deal at $120 million they're going to give him. Now, having said that, do you think that it's possible that the Montgomery and Snell and even his own situation last year, along with Chapman, do you think that there may be a little bit more trepidation among some of the players? Now, I'm not saying Scott Boras, but the players themselves, about not wanting to spend 4 months with your young family, like going through this whole, rigmarole, trying to figure out what's going to happen to you and not having a place to go on opening day. Because it's one thing when you're a free agent, it's another thing when you're giving up $60 million to do it, and you're giving up the certainty of being in a place that you're comfortable, or that you like. I mean, I don't know if he is comfortable, with the Cubs, and if this is a place he likes. It seems like there's a little bit more risk that one could anticipate than we might have thought prior to that, because there are some really good players who basically got lowballed by offers last year. And as you noted earlier, the RSN contracts for a lot of these cable providers have all gone to smithereens. And so there are a lot of teams that probably aren't going to be in the market to be able to afford to make a big, especially for someone in Bellinger's sort of profile, right? That range. And that could squeeze him out. I guess it seems if you had asked me last year, I'd say, that's a no-brainer, if you're in that situation. I just think that maybe the ground has shifted a little bit, and we've seen, as he has personally from his experience, that there's not as the guarantees that there used to be.
Yeah. Montgomery blamed Boris for what happened to him and got ties with him and went to a new agency.
Yeah.
The others who have stuck with him seem to pretty much trust him. And it seems like maybe he communicated better with them than he did with Montgomery. And they all felt like, we just didn't get the offers we thought we would get. And it's not because Scott wasn't there trying to push for him. It's just they didn't materialize. Now, a perfectly rational person might go, why would you think they materialized this year? You're 1 year older. In Cody's case, you definitely didn't have a better season.
What teams that didn't want you last year now have extra money to buy you this year?
Well, I will tell you, I think Boris has a few answers ready to that question.
Sure.
The Angels have said they're increasing payroll this winter. The Angels are exactly the kind of team who would spend an irresponsible amount of money on a Cody Bellinger.
No one will ever see him again, but it'll be nice to, I guess, it is warm there.
It does. And it does just take one, right? It only takes one team.
Yeah.
And Boris knows that. He's really believes in that mindset. I just have to find one. And I think the guys who have stuck with him, Bellinger, by all public indications and what very few sort of private ones I've been able to cobble together, pretty much buys in, pretty much believes that Boris has his best interests at heart and will get him the best deal possible, which doesn't mean they've decided to opt out or anything. I just think the reason I still view it as a coin flip, or maybe even that they're leaning toward opting out, is that it just seems like the more Scott Boras thing to do. And I don't think Cody Bellinger is applying the pressure that I would be if I were him, or, I would be if I were his wife or his friends or whoever, to lean against that optimism on Boras's part.
What would you say is the over-under on the number of teams that will spend in free agency this offseason on a individual player more than, say, $85 million in total contract? The number of teams that are willing to do that. Now, there may be teams that'll do that for more than one player, sure, but how many actual teams are willing to do that? Because you say it only takes one team. His market may only be like maximum 2 or 3 teams, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder if Boris will try and position him as a fallback for whoever doesn't get Juan Soto. That's
You mean
the New York
teams that aren't the
basically.
Yankees then?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's pretty much the same half dozen teams you can count on doing that every winter. There's not a winter that's going to go by that the Dodgers don't spend big on somebody. And this winter's not going to be an exception to that. But it
Dodgers and Phillies, but do they have room for Bellinger? That's the other thing too, you know, for his position or for where he brings value as a center fielder, ideally, probably.
I mean, those are all perfectly fair questions. And to me, the answer to most of them is probably no. And to Scott Boras, the answer doesn't matter. It's just I only have to find one. So I think, honestly, he's probably more likely to opt out, which would give the Cubs a bunch of flexibility, not just financially, but now that role is open. You know,
they desperately need an outfield /DH role because they have too many people between their farm system and the actual roster to be able to work through this, I think, right? Like,
if he opts in, I think they have to spend whatever money they're willing to spend, which hopefully is considerable, but spend that money on the pitching side. And they're probably going to have to solve their positional issues to the extent that they're aware that they have them. We know they have them, but I'm not sure they do. But they'll need to solve those problems through the trade market. If he opts out, they gain more flexibility, and, you know, making a big splash in free agency for a hitter becomes a lot more viable.
Looking at the outfielders under 30 this year coming up for free agents, you have 29-year-old Alex Verdugo, you have 29-year-old Cody Bellinger, and 26-year-old Juan Soto.
I'll take the 26-year-old.
Yes, that is the correct answer. Yeah, so,
and you know what? On those cold days at Wrigley when the wind's blowing in, you know what he can do to help win the games? He can walk.
He can walk.
Unbelievable.
Golly, he can walk, guys. He can walk. Anyway.
So you touched on a few of the issues heading into free agency for this team, Matt. Pat, I'll start with you. We've done this podcast. Who do you have to move somebody out to be able to bring somebody in? And then if so, is there anyone on this list of free agents that you'd want to move out a guy for? That, knowing that the Cubs are not in on Juan Soto, which is malpractice, which is a criminal for a major market team to not.
They don't deserve to be talked about in the context of Juan Soto until they prove once and for all that they're willing to actually sign a player of that caliber or even close to that caliber. And since they haven't done that in 8 years, I don't think that we owe them the courtesy of playing that game.
100%.
So so with that in mind, I think the problem the Cubs have is that they have under contract players for every spot on the field, with the possible exception of catcher, which I think could only be acquired through a trade. And we've talked about that before and some of the possibilities there. And there are some good plays out there, you know. So that leaves no open positions. So if you want to improve your offense, you're going to have to move somebody. And you're kind of limited on who that can be, I think, given the no trade clauses for your corner outfielders, your rookie center fielder and whatnot. So you're really looking at, and I know people would never want to say this because they just got him, but Michael Busch is one player. And the other is Nico Horner, who I know is also a fan favorite, but you know, no one's taking Dansby Swanson, the 4.0 highest WAR leader on the team, off your hands for the next 5 years. So it really, really, really limits what you can do. And whether that means trading somebody and getting a catcher is part of the deal and then signing a free agent. I mean, the thing about Busch is you really could use somebody with a lot of pop. And since Robinson Cano is retired, there aren't a whole lot of second basemen out there I can see as saying, oh yeah, we'll just replace Nico Horner with this free agent who's going to hit 35 homers. Carlos Baerga is not around, right? So I think we're looking at And Bush, that doesn't mean Bush couldn't play second base theoretically, but you're really looking at kind of a first base, and you don't even have a DH spot open anymore. I don't think, I guess if Bellinger's gone, you might be able to work this around with a corner outfielder / DH, but somewhere, somehow you've got to improve there. And the Bellinger decision will be instrumental in giving them that flexibility. But they also face this problem where they've got like 5 or 6 position players in the minors who legitimately either are at the stage of their careers in terms of the league they're in or the age or both, or performance, too, where they really need to be brought to this team at some point this year. Like, you can't, I think, go a whole complete year without bringing up Matt Shaw or without bringing up, any of the corner outfielders we were joking about, or even maybe, the Ballesteros. I mean, whatever, you've somebody somewhere, somehow these guys have to come up. You can't keep them all in the minors for another year, or only bring them up to sit on the bench and pinch hit twice in a 10-day period and then send it back down. So you kind of have to know what you have there, trade the ones that you think maybe aren't going to be able to, who maybe others will value higher than you do with your own internal crack scouting, and go from there. And it's risky. And I know they don't like doing risk stuff, right? But you've got to trade some players away, maybe find a team. One thing you can do, since the free agent market isn't particularly amenable to the Cubs' needs from an offensive position, one thing you could do is you could find a team that needs to shed payroll, and you could just buy players from them in exchange for prospects, whether that's somebody like, I don't know, Seattle Mariners. Like, I'd love to get Castillo, maybe. I don't know. I haven't seen him lately, but they also have Cal Raleigh at catcher, right? So, something like that. The A's are always a possibility. There are guys out there who might be gettable from teams who for either because their TV contracts fell apart, or they're just, they just want to be poor, or they want to have low payroll. That's fine. Better them than us, right? And so that's another possibility. And then the last thing I'll say is, if the Cubs are going to go and spend money in free agency, that leaves open the pitching possibilities. And people have various thoughts on Max Fried and Corbin Burns and any number of relievers. Go get 3 of them. I don't care which ones necessarily, but get some of them, and try to build enough depth on your roster that when half the people get hurt, let's just assume they will at some point, that you still have enough people to field a team. Sorry, I know there's a long answer, but
you hit all the right and important notes, though. And it really is. So first is that Bellinger choice, right? And that determines whether there's an obvious open spot or whether you have to kind of create one. Now, I will say, you sounded like people would be averse to trading Michael Busch. I have found a weirdly strong appetite for trading Michael Busch, because I think people so much like Nico Hoerner that they don't even want to consider trading him, maybe because they know, his contract is not as appealing to other teams as Busch's. But also, 1 year ago, you were the high guys on Michael Busch. I don't think you're going to find a trade market that's going to pay you 120% of what you just traded for Michael Busch, which, by the way, is turning out to be a lot, as we knew it might be at the time.
2 good pitchers.
And I also don't think, there are people who want to trade Hoerner and then slide Busch to second. And to me, no.
Yeah, I know that's kind of wishful thinking, probably. But
yeah,
I think after we saw him adjust to first base so well, it's like, well, maybe he's a magician and he can play anywhere.
It is okay to just have a great defensive first baseman. I know people think that's a waste, but and we also heard Hoyer talk like 18 times at the end of season press conference about the weather making it hard to evaluate hitters at Wrigley this year. Did some digging on that. Some of it is true. Some of it is crap. But I will say,
then I guess all our pitchers are bad too, because they all benefited from it.
Well, we don't talk about that part, Pat. Certainly Jed didn't. But Michael Busch probably does have a little more power than his raw numbers let on. That part is a little bit fair. So I think you just live with and leave Busch. Keep him right where he is. You'd have to get creative, though, if Bellinger doesn't opt out, about where you're going to find an upgrade. It's something like can you convince Willie Adames to come be a second baseman and trade Horner? And there's your 30 homer bat.
But I could give me his number.
And he's an awfully good player if he's not
Yeah.
forced to play shortstop, where his defense declined pretty sharply this year. But are you really going to outbid teams for whom Willie Adames would be a shortstop? So that's always tricky. There are teams who do it, but those teams are usually like the Mets, the teams who are willing to pay.
Although they
massive
kind
amounts
of do have a shortstop already, so I mean, we might be in a good position there.
Yeah,
The
well,
Mets.
but the Dodgers don't. So anyway, we don't have to break all that all the way down. Maybe Alex Bregman. Do you think he could be a second baseman instead of a third baseman? He's been a third baseman his whole career. Well, that's not because he's perfectly molded to be third baseman. It's because second base was taken when he turned out not to be a shortstop. Jose Altuve was in the way there. I think there are free agents you could consider who would be clear and obvious and important offensive upgrades for second base specifically. Or you could sign Bregman and see if you can find trade value, even though you would certainly be trading him for a little less than you probably gave up. Anyway, for Isaac Paredes. Those are options, but you'd have to get wildly creative. If Bellinger does opt out, it doesn't require quite as much creativity. It requires an appetite for bad right field defense again. How much can you stomach either Seiya Suzuki out there or putting 31-year-old Anthony Santander out there because he's going to hit you 40 homers? It comes down to
Patrick Wisdom. Let's not forget him.
I think I want to say this. I am among Cubdom one of the fierce defenders of Patrick Wisdom. I think when he plays every day, he gets into more of a rhythm and is a better hitter than when he's asked to come off the bench. Some guys are just like that, and he's one of them. 2, great dude in the clubhouse, and that's not without some value. And the third thing I will say is I think it is time to forget Patrick Wisdom. So he's,
But I will also note that he did everything he could have ever asked of him when he got
everything.
Here. That's the reality. When they made the trades and crushed the team in 21, he came in and he has been an absolute gem. Unfortunately, the kind of gem that would really shine more if he had a stronger team around him, and wasn't relied upon to be the only home run hitter in the lineup, which some days he really
although
did.
Again, it's like I think they tried to put him in that kind of role this year, and it just turns out he can't do the Patrick Wisdom thing and create 25 homer power on a semi-consistent basis if he's not playing on a semi-consistent basis. Unfortunate, just reality of his profile and maybe the stage of his career he's at. But on the way out the door, let's be very nice to the rare bench bat who is nominated for the Roberto Clemente Award. That says a lot about the guy.
For sure. What is your take on, I think a lot of fans are like, well, wait a minute. If we're going to trade Nico Horner, we'll do internal upgrades with Matt Shaw or, one of the other
Triantos
or one of those guys, within the system.
Matt Shaw's not ready. He's not. And I know that sounds a little bit strange because he's looked so polished, and you drafted him in part because he was a safe profile as a mid-round college bat. That dude uses a gigantic leg kick that will not work in the big leagues. And I know that once in a generation, there's a guy who gets by with a gigantic leg kick, but it's once in a generation, and you can't just
Willie
count on that.
Stargell, maybe,
or Justin Turner, to pick someone right now. But you can't just count on Matt Shaw being that guy. You're going to have to quiet that down so he doesn't get exploited by pitchers who are good at disrupting timing, of which there are a lot more in the big leagues than in the minors.
For sure.
Then once you do that, you get back to the fact that he's 5'9", 180. And where does the authority of contact come from if he can no longer gear up like he's, Happy Gilmore? So he's got big adjustments left that I think people are discounting because the numbers have looked really good at the highest levels of competition he can face, except in the big leagues. I think his ceiling is probably lower than people perceive. And I think reaching it is farther away than people perceive. So handing him the job next year is a non-starter, not for a team who really is serious about winning something next year. That doesn't mean he can't have a significant role on next year's team. But I also think, you mentioned it. It's Shaw, it's Triantos, it's Casey, it's Alcantara, it's Ballesteros. I don't know how you go through this winter without identifying a couple of those guys that someone else believes in more than you, someone somewhere, and trading them. That's how you, like, the best way to use this farm system is to consolidate it a little bit into expensive parts, into expensive players you already know are good in the big leagues. And you mentioned it, Pat. There are going to be a lot of teams out there looking to shed payroll this winter. My full-time job is managing editor of Twins Daily. I can tell you they'd love to clear some money. So it comes down to somewhat the appetite to become a more expensive team and do some big daring things. Like you mentioned, there's not been a great chance to fully evaluate these players yet because you don't know, based on what they've done against AAA competition, you can't be sure whether they're going to be good or not. You might get burned, but you also need to take that chance at some point, because if you sit around and wait for playing time to open up one at a time for these guys, 2 more years are going to trickle by. It's going to turn out they're not as good as you want them to be, and you're going to have missed the window to win anything with, and I'm not saying that this should be the spine and core of your World Series contender, but Justin Steele, Ian Happ, Dansby Swanson, Jameson Taillon, Shota Imanaga, these guys aren't going to be good in 3 years, and most of them aren't going to be your property in 3 years. You need to capitalize a bit, and you can do that by taking advantage of all these teams who need to tighten their belts when you absolutely do not, because you're the Cubs and you've been underspending your market, not overspending it. So that it's going to come down very much to their willingness to do that very simple thing.
We talked a lot about what the Cubs need to do next season. Let's go out on a high note. Let's go out with some positivity, and let's reminisce about the things that we did enjoy about the 2024 Cubs season. Now that it's in the book, we talked a lot about the issues. This podcast every week, we did a deep dive into a lot of those. Let's take some time to celebrate our favorite moments, our highlights for 2024. Pat, this was your idea, and I love it. Thought it was a great idea.
Right.
I'll let you go first.
I got 3 quick ones for you. 2 of the games I was at, and one of the games I wish I could have gone to, but it was in Pittsburgh. So game 1, June 5th, Cubs Sox. My wife and I went to the game. Cubs win 7-6, bottom of the 9th.
Yep.
It is the first game in 50 years where there was a home run hit on the first pitch of the game and the last pitch of the game. The Cubs gave up a home run to Julks. I don't even know who that is on the first. I mean, I do, but not. Yeah, I know. I'm joking, but on the first pitch, and then of course Mike Tauchman walked it off against Michael Kopech, and we were all happy the Cubs swept that series because the White Sox were in the midst of this downward spiral where they'd lost like 100 out of the last 101 games or something. So we had a lot of pressure on us, and we won. It was a fun night, great weather. Cubs win. Right. And the Cubs were starting to, it was one of those, it was early June, but it felt like we were about to turn a corner. We weren't, but
no,
it felt like it.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to jump. Yeah. I'm going to jump in right there because that was also on my list, was that the first home game against the White Sox was also on my list. You have to remember the White Sox were 15-46 coming into that series, and the Cubs had just dropped series to the Cardinals, Brewers, and Reds in a row. Yeah. So this was so big. Losing to this White Sox team would have sent them into a spiral. I can't imagine. We would have never seen them come out of it. So this was huge. Like you mentioned, it felt like maybe they were going to turn a corner. You had to stop the bleeding, is what you had to do, and they did by winning those 2 games.
We just swept the White Sox, yeah. Again. Okay, or I guess we did it later. So the second game was on August 28th. I referred to it. It was in Pittsburgh. It was a getaway day in Pittsburgh. The Cubs had won the first 2 games of the series, and were actually playing really well. This was the month the Cubs were good, August. And the Cubs were rolling, and Kyle Hendricks started, and it went poorly, and really poorly. Cubs are down 10-3 in the 7th inning. And I remember I was at a Culver's having lunch thinking, okay, well, this game's over. And I looked at my Twitter, and I saw the Cubs scored 10-5 at least. And then before you know it, the Cubs score 6 runs in the 9th inning, win the game 14-10. I mean, for the life of me, the Cubs scored 11 runs in the last 3 innings. There was some other major league. It was the only time it happened this year, but it was the first time in several thousand games or something that somebody come back in the 7th inning or later from down 7 runs to win a game. We'd blown a game earlier in the year down up 7 runs, but that was earlier in the game. It wasn't this late in the game. And it was a great game because, PCA was 4 for 4, plus they intentionally walked him in the 9th, thank God. But the big guy in that game was our buddy who we may never see again, but Betancourt was like 3 for 5. It's 7 runs batted in, including the game winner. I mean, just a wonderful game for him. And the Cubs ended up winning the game, sweeping the series, and really at that moment, it felt like, this team has a chance to make the playoffs here. We just have to keep this up. That did not happen. They played 500 the following month. And then my last game, which I was also in attendance at, was September 28th, end of the year, Saturday, Cubs-Reds. Cubs win 3-0. But I went solely for the reason of watching one of my adulthood heroes. I don't have a lot of those these days. Kyle Hendricks pitched his last game as a Cubs starter at Wrigley Field, where he has so many times provided the most masterful moments and some of the most memorable games of my life. And he went out and pitched 7 1/3 innings, only gave up 2 hits, gave up no runs, and was his old self. It was almost like, he'd gone through a time machine, And of course, he didn't get the win because the Cubs didn't score until the following inning. But that's apropos of the season, right, for the Cubs. But the Cubs did win 3-0. It was a really fast game. It was a Hendricks special. It was like, one of those like 2-hour games or whatever. It was just, super fast. And it was nice because they let him start the 8th, get an out. And then as he came off the field, and I was sitting sort of by the Cubs dugout, like in the low and intentionally, like where I would see him coming in and out. So seeing him come in and obviously he was emotional. Everybody was. They all came out and hugged him, on the field, and it was just a real great game and great experience in what was otherwise a disappointing season, but that was the highlight for me.
Matt,
there was just one really cool part of that day too. Was the most difficult or almost heartbreaking thing about Hendricks's departure here, probable departure, is he's the last one, right? And the threads tying him and this team back to the 2016 team are so thin. It was very cool that Craig Counsell sent Tommy Hotovy, who doesn't stretch all the way back to 2016, but has this long relationship with Hendricks and basically has been with him through 2 miniature career renaissances, that he sent him out to make the change. That was another great touch. They did that right. Jeremy, you want me to go next?
Yeah, go for it. Mm-hmm.
See, you're too generous a host. All the good ones are going to be taken. May 7th against the Padres was a great night. Yes. Shota Imanaga, dealing. He dealt all the way through until like his last start in May before anyone really touched him. But on this particular night, Counsell was, the bullpen was depleted. They had started to kind of slide after that strong April. And Counsell was shopping for, can I stretch him? Can I really stretch him now? He had just, in the 6th, I think he struck out Manny Machado and Xander Bogaerts back-to-back with runners on base, and big explosion of emotion coming out of there. Cruised through the 7th. They tried to get some out of him in the 8th with a 1-0 lead, and he gave up 2 runs, an infield single and then a home run. That was the luck that the Cubs had through the early part of the season. So now they're down. They come back in the 8th, the Tauchman walk, a Cody Bellinger single. Christopher Morel, of all people, putting the bat on the ball with a runner in scoring position in less than 2 outs. Sac fly to bring home the tying run. And then the bottom of the 9th, Michael Busch, whom the league had just sort of figured out. He had that torrid stretch in April, hit 5 home runs in 5 straight games. Was looking awesome. Then they started eating him up with high fastballs, just killing him there. He had a hole in his swing. And then suddenly he didn't anymore. And De Los Santos tried to sneak a high fastball by him, and instead he torches it. It was not a wall scraper, a no-doubter to right center where it's hard to hit the ball out at night at Wrigley to walk off. That was a great game, and you felt like the upward trajectory from here. Obviously, all of these moments that we felt like there was upward trajectory coming, we were wrong, but it sure was a good feel.
It was important at the time.
Don't you think, Matt, that's what kind of, if you wanted to take the season and put it in and distill it to its ultimate, it was the ups and downs. It's like your heart was broken at least 2 or 3 times a week, and then you would have these exhilarating games a couple times a week. And it's so hard to think of a season where it's one day then the next day. You're just used to having it be more like last year, where it's like, okay, we're bad, then we're good, then we're bad. Here it was just like every other day. It was so exhausting.
Riding the seesaw. And I think, honestly, I think that's a sign of Council doing some good management. He didn't let things get into as deep a funk as they could have at a lot of points, but he just didn't have the talent to actually push this team out to a really long stretch of dominant baseball, which is what they needed. Anyway, May, I think it was 28th, the Tuesday after Memorial Day in Milwaukee. Ben Brown threw 7 no-hit innings with 10 strikeouts at the Brewers. That was a moment, man. Ben Brown, it's easy to forget now because we don't know whether we ever see that version of Ben Brown again. Sort of a mysterious and difficult injury that they had trouble managing all through the second half. He didn't appear after late June, maybe. But boy, for a moment, he was the story of the season. And this
the only
was
game we won in that series, that 4-game series, right? I mean, that was huge.
Well, and they almost didn't win it because they had an early lead on a Busch homer. Brown plows through the Brewers, and then Hector Neris gives up the lead in the 9th and probably would have given up the game right then and there, except Ian Happ nails Willie Adames at second with an outfield assist because Ian Happ never leaves Milwaukee without an outfield assist. And then in the 10th, they get a little bit lucky, and then they just keep stringing it. They were relentless. In that moment, this team that too often was not relentless, was not ruthless that way, they did, and they just piled on 5 extra runs, and they won the game in extra innings. That was a great game, showed some resiliency, showed some flashes of the youth movement they hoped they were getting underway. Good win. And then finally, I'll take September 10th at the Dodgers. That was the game. Shota pitched very well again. The offense basically ran on chaos that night. It was a lot of Dodger mistakes, but they were putting the ball in play so they could actually take advantage of those mistakes. They were running the bases creatively. They came back from behind in the 8th inning, and then PCA, 2 crazy catches in the late innings. And that game was also shut down by Porter Hodge, which I think it's important that we acknowledge he was one of the great stories of the season. So that was a good feeling win, even though they weren't able to convert the next night and finish off that sweep or do anything good in Colorado. So didn't come to a lot, but that was a very fun game.
For me, we'll close it out here. Just a couple notes. The June 19th game was a Wednesday day game. It was hot. It was so hot. And we were in the bleachers, Pat.
Hey, I was there with you.
That's right. We were celebrating James Naveau's birthday in the bleachers. Injuries to the rotation had forced Kyle Hendricks back into the starting rotation. And we were not confident in his abilities at this point in the season. He pitched 5 no-hit innings against the Giants, who the Cubs were battling with in the wild card race at this point. He pitched 5 2/3, and the only run he gave up was in the 6th inning on a fielder's choice groundout. So just an awesome performance from Kyle that every time he went out, you didn't know if this was like the last time you were going to see him have a good performance. It was very inconsistent. Happ and Swanson went back-to-back with home runs, and then in the top of the 8th, Jorge Soler hits a grand slam to cut the lead to 6-5, and we were panicked in the bleachers until Brewer in the 9th comes in to close it out for us, and he walks 2 guys, and we're like, all right, this game is over. This is a loss. But then he ends up hanging on to get the save, and the Cubs win. Just a great time out in the bleachers there. And the last piece I wanted to call out, you mentioned Hendricks last game, Pat. That, of course, is on my list. Honorable mention for me for the 2 tributes, the Baez tribute and the Rizzo tribute, when they came to town. Both the the way that the Wrigley Field fans gave them the flowers that they deserved, and a tremendous job by the video team of putting together really good video packages for both Baez and Rizzo. So it was that was it. Like that, you watch those, and it was tugging on all the heartstrings, because this was the end of the 20. This was closure for 2016 as well, for seeing those guys for the first time. So those were our favorite moments this season. Just tremendous. And we are going to close out this season like we close out every podcast, by visiting the 1984 Cubs, because this was the 40th anniversary of that 1984 Cubs team, Pat. And we've gone through, we've covered the entire season week to week. We juxtaposed it with what the 2024 Cubs were doing. And last we spoke, the Cubs had won the division, and they were going to the playoffs, Pat.
96 and 65, the Cubs won the National League East, taking on the San Diego Padres, winners of the National League West. The only two teams in the National League who had never won the divisional series before, when they faced each other. Back in those days, the way the playoff system works, a lot of people think, the Cubs didn't get the extra home game, even though they had the better record, because of the lights. It's not actually the lights. It's the fact that the league would alternate every year. Who, the West or the East, who would get the extra home game. And this, of course, perfect Cub moment. The Cubs did not get the extra game, right? So the first two games were at Wrigley, and then the 3 games in San Diego. One little fun fact that I think people may not know is that, did you know that for the first 4 games of this series, the umpires were not there because they were on strike? Big Ten umpires officiated the games.
Wow.
I'm not kidding you.
How? Oh, God.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So imagine that. And it cost the Cubs a chance at the World Series. But I digress. Game 1, got home from school. Cubs are up. Listening like on the transistor radio and stuff, and on the bus, and like, I mean, the Cubs just blew them out 13-0. It was a windy day. Wind was blowing out, but so what? The Cubs crushed them. Bobby Dernier led off with a home run. It was like very Dexter Fowler Game 7 like against the Guardians, right? Gary Matthews had 2 home runs. Ron Say had a home run. And, of course, Rick Sutcliffe launched one out of the ballpark onto Sheffield Avenue in right field, while also pitching 7 innings, giving up 2 hits and no runs, 8 strikeouts, and recorded his then – I don't know, like 16th win in a row, or 15th win in a row, I guess, if you count, from the season, as 21st overall. Cubs cruised to a 13-0 victory. Ernie Banks was the honorary coach for the Cubs. So he not only threw out the first pitch, but got to sit on the bench in uniform, which was kind of nice for him. And then Cubs had 16 hits and 6 walks. That's 22 base runners. It was just a real fun game. Next day, a little bit closer, but still more of the same. The Cubs won 4-2 behind Steve Trout, who we talked a lot about. Steve Trout had some solid games that year. 8 1/3 innings, 5 hits, 2 runs, perfectly acceptable. Only 2 strikeouts. It's the 80s. Lee Smith comes in and saves the game. Gary Matthews gets his 5th RBI of the day. Say and Jody Davis have big hits. Dernier and Sandberg, as they did in the first game, just keep getting on base and scoring the whole game. It was a lot of fun. And the Cubs headed to San Diego up 2-0. This is the point at which my grandfather got me a T-shirt that said Chicago Cubs NL Champs, which I have somewhere in storage to this day. There was a lot of optimism, as you can imagine, with the Cubs headed to San Diego up 2-0 against a team that was clearly a weaker opponent. The Game 3 was kind of a disaster. Dennis Eckersley was pitching. Future Hall of Famer, my ass, right? That guy. Yeah, okay. So when he left, maybe. When he when he was with Cleveland and Boston, maybe. But when he was the Cubs, he had a decent year in 1984 and 85, but he was not Hall of Fame quality. This game, he certainly was. He went 5 1/3, gave up 9 hits and 5 earned runs, and the Cubs lost the game 7-1. Just write it off. It's sort of like that Zambrano game against the Marlins when the Cubs were up 3-1. You're like, oh, good. Well, we'll just we got one
plenty more
shots.
Plenty more shots.
Yeah. Game 4, interesting decision. The Cubs decided to go with Scott Sanderson. Now they could have gone with Rick Sutcliffe on 3 days rest, but they didn't. They went with Sanderson. And then they could have had Trout in game 5 if they'd wanted to. This was a Jim Fry decision. I remember I was at a Notre Dame game with my dad. Bad timing, but we bought the tickets not realizing the Cubs were going to go to the playoffs 6 months later. And it rained, it poured in South Bend. Notre Dame lost, and the Cubs lost 7-5. It was a game where the Cubs actually had a lead for much of the game. They were up 3-2 in the bottom of the 5th, and Jody Davis and Leon Durham had hit home runs for the Cubs. Then they fell down 5-3 in the 8th, but they came back and tied the game 5-5. And in the bottom of the 9th, sadly, and Scott Sanderson hadn't pitched particularly well, but bottom of the 9th, the Cubs brought in Lee Smith, who gives up a 2-run home run to stupid Steve Garvey, who's still around somehow.
Yeah.
Steve Garvey hadn't hit a home run since August 15th. And here we are on October 6th or whatever, and he's hitting a home run just in the nick of time to beat the Cubs 7-5.
It's about 3 weeks until I will spend just a little bit of time on a busy night. I will spend just a little bit of time watching Steve Garvey get his butt kicked for fun. About 3 weeks from now.
Sadly, at this time, we were in the car post-game, Notre Dame game, listening to the game on the radio. Because back then the radio announcers were still the actual Cub announcers, right? It wasn't like, the national TV. I think that's still the case now, right? Like
on radio, you have national or local option.
Yeah. So we obviously chose a local option, and needless to say, it was not a great conversation at the time. I think, was Luke Boudreau still in the booth? Gosh, I wonder. But back in those days, Harry Carey would do 3 innings on TV, then 3 on the radio. They would alternate. It was he and Milo Hamilton or whomever. And so it was depressing. But it all set up for Game 5, which was October 7th, the day before my birthday, Jeremy. It's a Sunday. I remember that because we started off the day watching Walter Payton break the all-time rushing record. Woohoo! Big day for Chicago. Mm-hmm. And during the NFL pregame, Jimmy the Greek picked the Cubs to win Game 5 of the World Series. He said, it's Sutcliffe we trust, or something to that effect. And Sutcliffe had earned the trust over the years. So the Cubs actually got out to a 3-0 lead. And then the Padres scored a couple runs. So it was 3-2. And it was 7th inning. And Sutcliffe was still on the mound. He had been faltering a little bit, but he'd thrown a lot of innings. All those shutouts in 9 and 8 inning games he pitched, the last half of the year might have been wearing on him. Guy gets on base, sack bunt over to second, ground ball to Leon Durham, who famously misses the ball, goes under his legs. The tying run scores to make it 3-3. There's the story about how Sandberg had accidentally knocked over some like juice or Gatorade onto his glove before the inning or whatever, and had to switch gloves or something. I don't know. Who knows? Fry left Sutcliffe in the game, and he gave up a single, and then Tony Gwynn was up, leaves him in the game to face Tony Gwynn, tough hitter for a right-handed pitcher. For any pitcher, really. He gets a double, drives in 2 runs, so the Cubs are now down, and then leaves him in the game, and Steve Garvey, decrepit old Steve Garvey, former Dodger, gets an RBI, and the Cubs are now down and stay down by 3 runs, and it was like 6-3 was the final. It was a real, even to this day, you wonder like why Fry left him. And then he brought in Steve Trout, and the Cubs didn't give up any more runs that inning, or... Yeah.
And even by like 15 years later, that would have been unthinkable. I mean, you wouldn't have your ace on the mound with a lead in the 8th inning, but the very dangerous heart of the opposing order coming up in an elimination game.
Never.
If it was, say, Mark Pryor, and you would go to your
Right.
bullpen in that case, surely,
Right.
and
Yes,
not make
exactly.
the same error. So, yeah, it's just one of those things. Unfortunately, 1984 was too early, but
Is
we
today
know
the
that.
anniversary of that Bartman game, by the way? It might be.
Yeah, it is.
I was
And
there for that one too. I catch all the good ones.
Mhm.
Yeah, because Facebook reminded me. There's a picture of me and the guys taken right before the 8th inning, just for fun, on a camera, which was hard to come by in those days.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the Cubs lost. The Padres went on to the World Series and got completely destroyed by the Detroit Tigers. There was a possibility of that rematch this year, but they both lost, so did not happen. And I kept some grudges on that Padres team. They became my most hated players as a kid, and whenever they would have an ill-fated demise or play poorly or get cut, I crossed them off my list. I had a list of all
That
their names.
that damn Tony Gwynn was so likable, but you know who never gave you that kind of a problem was Steve Garvey.
Yes, Steve
Right.
Garvey or Eric
Right
Shao.
to this day, easy to root against.
Yes, Eric Shao was the pitcher on the Padres who got lit up by the Cubs on the first game, but who later would have the confrontation with Andre Dawson, which would be very memorable in 1987. We've talked about before, but yeah, it was talk about bittersweet. The Cubs came within one game of the World Series. They had 3 chances to do it. It is the Cubs ended up having, I think, in my lifetime, 6 such opportunities to put away a team and to go to the World Series, and they were 0 for 6 until 2016, which is one of the reasons why I have so much respect for the likes of Kyle Hendricks and the other Cubs players on that team who were able to come back and win that series, especially Kyle Hendricks in Game 7. And so it was a sad day. I refused to eat cake or open my gifts because I was too upset. It was a
Really?
late afternoon game. It didn't end until like 6:30 at night or something, And I went in my room and shut the door and would not come out. Happy birthday.
I think, and I'm too young to have been around for any of this, but I think people need to remember that this was a team that the Cubs had not even played in the postseason, which had only been expanded
in my
beyond the
lifetime.
World Series for 15 years at that point.
My dad's lifetime. Sorry.
Yeah. The Cubs hadn't seen the postseason in 39 years. They had no training. Their fans had no real concept for how to like, it was such an incredible summer. This team basically came out of nowhere. No one expected them to be that good.
Yeah.
They were that good. They were clearly the best team in the National League. And then to lose 3 straight when you just could have put them away with 1, and you had opportunities to win 2 of those games. It's just,
I hadn't in my conscious lifetime ever seen a Cubs team finish over 500. So
yeah.
It had been a rough 12 years of Cub of before that game. But I mean, it was, you're right. The Cubs were always losers. They came back, they were great, and they came so close. Now, had they won that game and gone to the World Series, with some of the mystique of the sort of the chance to go to the World Series dissipated at that point? Probably, right? So I guess it made 2016 all the more special. Let's look at the bright side.
I mean,
everyone
I think
listening to this podcast was probably alive in 2016, unlike the 84 team.
The reason you guys are spent so much loving time recapping this team all year, and why it was one of my favorite segments every week, is that I'm not sure how many single seasons in any team's history that didn't include a championship were as pivotal, as definitive, as sort of shaping for the fan culture and everything the team is, as 1984 was.
For better, frankly, and other things, in terms of like, it really helped propel the Cubs into the modern era in a lot of ways. And Dallas Green was trying to do that with the organization, but it really, some of the improvements they started making with the ballpark, and ultimately they ended up getting lights, after this. But whether that's an improvement or not, I guess, probably in the grand scheme of things, at least for concerts. But no, it was a seminal moment, and one that I guess I'll always remember. And I never quite have looked at the Padres the same way since, and certainly not Steve Garvey. Good God. Yep. Sorry it ended on such a tough note. I hope people knew ahead of time that's what was going to happen, because I hate to have. It's one of those shows where after the 5th season, like your favorite characters die, like at the end. Like, I don't know.
This to that point though, can you imagine being a big enough Cubs fan to tune into this podcast with any regularity and not already knowing? You can't. So that it was 40 years ago and everyone knew that this is how it ended, even if
had the Cubs won the World Series in '84, I truly believe they would have become the '85 Bears, in the sense that they had some characters on the team. Like like Ryan Sandberg, great guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gary Matthews, Rick Sutcliffe, Bobby Dernier. These guys, I still see them around, at various events and in the neighborhood and stuff, having lunch and stuff at various times. And just a bunch of guys who were good guys. I mean, and we've talked about some of the role players that were on that team too, that I think deserve, attention and credit. And it's just Tim Stoddard and people like that, Lee Smith. Lee Smith, by the way, had open heart surgery a couple months ago. I just found that out the other day. It's like, I hope he's recovering well. But it was a good group of guys, and it would have been a real fairy tale story. Instead, we had to wait 32 more years, but we did get there.
Matt, you so eloquently summarized the importance of the 1984 team. Thank you for that. Pat, thank you for all the hard work you did in putting together these segments every single week throughout the season. It was fantastic, and I will do my part by putting together a supercut of all of these into one giant podcast episode that you can see on YouTube or listen to through your podcatcher of choice. That'll come out in the off season. So
sadly, it'll have the same running time as Apocalypse Now, but probably the same ending too.
You have till the winter meetings to finish the entire podcast. It'll be perfect for a road trip or a flight somewhere. Sit back and relax and enjoy the 84 Cubs if you missed any of the segments over the course of the entire season. So with that, we're going to wrap it up for this week. We're going to wrap it up for this season. Matt, please remind our listeners how they can follow you on X and again, find your websites.
Yeah, at MA Trueblood, and I'll pretty much put out anything that I've written, link it there, but definitely swing by northsidebaseball.com. We've got a lot planned for the off season, some caretaker specific content from writers from across the internet who bring deep dives and some really great stuff. So I hope people will stop by and join the community there.
Make sure you're following us at Wrigleyville Nat and continue to stay subscribed to this podcast, as we will be dropping that supercut. We're going to be popping in when there's news to talk about throughout the off season. So make sure you stay subscribed. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, what are you waiting for? You'll want to watch the supercut, because Pat brought all kinds of items and souvenirs throughout the entire season. He showed them. We're going to have those all up on the YouTube channel.
Actually, hold on just 1 second.
Oh, he's got a bonus. I'll have to edit this into the supercut later. But he's so if you're subscribed to YouTube, you can watch the video version of this podcast as well. What do we got here?
Don't drink coffee, but what life would be complete without the 1984 National League East Chicago Cub roster on a coffee cup?
Very nice.
How could you really enjoy your coffee without it?
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff you can see over at the YouTube channel on the video version of this podcast. Make sure, even if you don't consume your podcast through the video form, throw us a subscribe over there. It helps us work the algorithm so other Cub fans can find the show. And with that, we're calling it a season. We're calling it a podcast. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks to all of our patrons who kept the lights on for another season and kept us ad-free over at patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. Thanks to everybody who listens and tells their friends about the show. Thank you to everyone, and we will talk to you again next time.